She arrived on a Tuesday with nothing but a lie and a trunk that weighed as much as a dead man's sins. The whole town of Ridge Creek watched from the platform as the stranger stepped off the train. Too elegant, too still, too wrong for a place like Wyoming. And the man waiting for her? He'd ordered a wife the same way he'd ordered fence posts. Practical, necessary, replaceable. He had no idea the woman walking toward him was being hunted. He had no idea that Iron Trunk held enough secrets to bury them both. If you want to know how a lie saved a family, stay with me until the end. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and let's begin. The letter had taken 11 days to reach Chicago. By the time it arrived, Vivian Blackwood had already made up her mind, though she wouldn't admit that to herself until much later, sitting in a jolting train car somewhere west of Cheyenne, with her hands folded too tightly in her lap and her heart hammering against her ribs like something trying to escape a locked room. She read the letter 3 times on the platform before she boarded, not because she needed to memorize the words. She'd already done that. But because holding paper gave her hands something to do that wasn't shaking. Dear Miss or Madam, I am writing in response to the advertisement placed in the Prairie Hearth Matrimonial Gazette, dated January 4th. My name is Gideon Ashcroft. I am 37 years of age, a rancher, a widower, with 1 daughter of 7 years. I am not a man of many words, so I will not pretend otherwise. I need a wife who can work. The winters here are not kind, and neither is the land. I can offer a roof, food, and fair treatment. If you are practical and honest, write back. If you are looking for romance, look elsewhere. Yours respectfully, Gideon Ashcroft, Ridge Creek, Wyoming Territory. Practical. Honest. Vivian had folded the letter into her coat pocket and purchased a one-way ticket to Wyoming. She was neither of those things. Not anymore. The train smelled like coal smoke and wet wool and the particular desperation of people traveling too far from home. Vivian sat in a second-class car, deliberately, carefully second class, with her back straight and her eyes forward and the enormous iron-bound trunk shoved beneath her feet, wedged against the seat in front like she was daring it to move. She'd paid 2 porters extra to load it without asking questions. She'd paid a third to keep his mouth shut about how heavy it was. The woman sitting across from her, a stout, cheerful matron named Mrs. Paulson, who was visiting her daughter in Laramie, had tried to make conversation 3 separate times, and each time Vivian had answered with polite, minimal words until the woman gave up and went back to her knitting. Vivian wasn't trying to be rude. She was trying to become someone else. That took concentration. She had packed very little by way of clothing. 2 practical dresses, both dark, both purchased specifically because they were the sort of things she'd never worn in her previous life. A warm coat, sturdy boots, broken in over 6 weeks of deliberately wearing them around the house every evening until her feet stopped complaining. She'd taken a pair of leather work gloves and a wool hat that was frankly hideous, and she'd made herself keep it even though her instinct was to leave it behind. She could not afford instincts anymore. She could not afford anything that connected her to the woman she'd been 3 months ago. But the trunk was another matter. She'd told herself she would leave it. She'd stood in the parlor of the Chicago townhouse that no longer felt like hers, looking at the thing, and she'd thought, leave it, start with nothing, be no one. She hadn't left it. She couldn't explain even to herself exactly why. Part of it was practical. The contents were necessary. They were survival. They were the difference between freedom and vulnerability. Part of it was something she didn't have clean language for. Something stubborn and frightened and deeply, humiliatingly human. The trunk was the last thing she controlled. She wasn't ready to let it go. The train pulled into Ridge Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, running 40 minutes late due to ice on the tracks outside of Cheyenne. Vivian knew it was 40 minutes because she'd been counting. She'd been counting a lot of things lately. It was easier than thinking. She gathered herself before the train stopped, checked that her hair was pinned correctly, that her expression was neutral rather than terrified, that her gloves were on and buttoned. Small things. Controllable things. Then the car lurched to a stop, and she stood up, and the porter came for her luggage, and her life, such as it was, resumed. She saw him before he saw her. He was standing at the far end of the platform with his hat in his hands. Not because he was being polite, she'd realize later, but because he'd been turning it in circles so long he'd forgotten he was holding it. He was taller than she'd expected, broader through the shoulder. He had the look of a man who'd spent years outdoors in weather that didn't care about him, and his face showed it, weathered, angular, with a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete sometime around his 30th birthday, and never quite relaxed since. He was scanning the train cars with an expression that suggested he was already regretting this decision. Vivienne took a breath. She walked toward him. She watched the exact moment his eyes landed on her, watched the recognition of that must be her, and then the immediate involuntary confusion of that can't possibly be her. His brow drew together. His mouth pressed flat. He looked briefly like a man who'd ordered a workhorse and been delivered a chandelier. She stopped 3 feet in front of him and extended her hand. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said, "I'm Vivienne. I believe you've been expecting me." He looked at her hand for a moment before he shook it. His grip was firm and his palm was rough with calluses, and he let go quickly, like he'd touched something he hadn't been given permission to touch. "You're smaller than I expected," he said. It was, she supposed, better than "you're not what I wanted." "People often say that," Vivienne replied, which was not true at all. No one had ever described her as small in her life. But she was already learning to say things that kept conversations from going further than she needed them to go. Gideon looked past her toward the train. "You have luggage?" "Yes." "How much?" She hesitated for exactly the length of time it took the porter to emerge from the luggage car, struggling under the weight of the iron trunk, 2 other men helping him guide it down the steps. It hit the platform with a sound like a safe being dropped, and the wood planking shuddered. Every head on the platform turned. Gideon Ashcroft stared at the trunk. Then he looked at Vivienne. "That's yours," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "What's in it?" "My things," she said simply. Something moved across his face. Not quite suspicion yet, not quite wariness. Something more like a man recalculating a situation he thought was already figured out. "All right," he said after a long moment. He put his hat back on his head and turned toward the wagon at the edge of the platform. "I'll need to get the horses for that." The ride out to the ranch took nearly an hour over frozen roads that weren't quite roads, more like suggestions of roads. Packed dirt paths through sage and snow, with wheel ruts deep enough to swallow a boot hole. The sky was the color of old pewter, pressing down close and heavy, and the wind had a particular Wyoming personality that Vivienne had no frame of reference for. It didn't gust so much as lean, a constant cold pressure that found every gap in her coat and made itself at home. She sat on the wagon bench beside Gideon and said nothing for the first 20 minutes. He said nothing either. She began to think this was going to be all right. She could manage silence. She'd been managing it for weeks. Then he said without looking at her, "You've never worked a ranch before." Not a question, an observation, and not a gentle one. "I haven't," Vivienne said. "You've done farm work?" "No." "Livestock?" "No." "Winter preservation? Canning, drying, smoke curing?" "I'm willing to learn." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It wasn't remotely close to a laugh, actually. It was more of an exhale that had given up on optimism. "The woman I wrote to at the agency," he said carefully, "they described you as an experienced homesteader, said you'd grown up on a working farm in Ohio." Vivienne kept her gaze on the frozen horizon. "The agency may have been optimistic in their description." "Optimistic," he repeated. "Yes. That the word you're going with." She said nothing. He didn't push it, but she could feel the shift in him, something closing up, a door she hadn't realized was open, swinging quietly shut. They rode the rest of the way in silence. The ranch was called the Ashcroft Homestead on the county records in Gideon's place by everyone in Ridge Creek, and it was neither charming nor picturesque, nor any of the things Vivienne's imagination had lazily constructed during 11 days of train travel. It was a 2-story timber house with a porch that listed slightly to the left, a barn that was weathered gray but structurally sound, 3 outbuildings of varying purposes, and a yard full of frozen mud and fence posts and the particular organized chaos of a place where every piece of wood and iron had a job to do, and nothing existed merely to be beautiful. Vivienne looked at it for a long moment from the wagon. She thought about the townhouse in Chicago with its plaster medallions and imported wallpaper and the chandelier in the front hall that had cost more than this entire property was likely worth. She thought, Good. She thought, no one will ever look for me here. Ooh. The little girl was waiting on the porch. She was 7 years old and she had her father's coloring. Dark hair, direct eyes, the same quality of careful watchfulness, but there was something softer in her face, something that hadn't yet learned to armor itself. She was clutching a rag doll to her chest with both arms, and she was staring at Vivian with an expression that was caught exactly halfway between hope and the kind of suspicion that children develop when hope has hurt them before. Elsie, Gideon said, stepping down from the wagon. Come meet Miss Vivian. Elsie didn't move from the porch step. Is she going to stay? That's the plan. Elsie's gaze moved to the iron trunk being unloaded from the wagon. Her eyes went wide. What's that? That's my trunk, Vivian said. She'd walked to the base of the porch steps, and she crouched down so she was closer to the girl's eye level, which was harder to do gracefully in a wool coat than she anticipated, and she was reasonably sure she looked ridiculous doing it, but she did it anyway. I'm Vivian. I've heard a great deal about you, Elsie. Elsie looked at her with enormous, assessing eyes. Papa said you'd be a working woman. He did. He said he needed someone who could split wood and mend harness leather. Elsie tilted her head. Can you do that? Vivian looked at her own hands. Slim, pale, the hands of a woman who'd spent her adult life in drawing rooms and conservatories and the offices of solicitors arguing over inheritance law. Not yet, she said honestly. Elsie considered this for a moment. Mama couldn't split wood either when she came here, she said finally. Papa taught her. Then she turned and went inside, still clutching the rag doll, leaving Vivian crouching at the base of the porch steps in the Wyoming cold, wondering if that had been offered as comfort or simply information. She decided to take it as both. Baz. The first week was, to use the most accurate word available, a disaster. Not a dramatic disaster. Nothing caught fire, no one was injured, the livestock survived, but a quiet, grinding, relentless series of small failures that accumulated like snow. Vivian burned the porridge on Monday. She burned it because she'd never made porridge in her life, and because she'd refused to admit this, and had instead stood over the stove with the determined expression of a woman solving a mathematical problem, adding heat and stirring in patterns she'd invented herself, until the smell of scorched grain filled the kitchen, and Gideon came in from the barn and looked at the pot and then at her and said very carefully, You cooked before. I'm familiar with the concept of cooking, Vivian said. That's not what I asked. She threw the porridge out and they ate bread and butter for breakfast, and no one said anything about it. Elsie shot Vivian a glance across the table that was either pity or solidarity. It was hard to tell with Elsie. Tuesday, she tried to feed the horses and came away with a bruised palm, an enormous respect for a creature that could communicate displeasure so efficiently with so little effort. Wednesday, she got the porridge right but forgot to add salt, and Gideon ate 2 bowls of it anyway without saying a word, which was somehow worse than criticism. Thursday, she split her thumb open trying to chop kindling, wrapped it in a kitchen cloth, and went back to chopping because stopping felt like failure, and she had a limited appetite for failure, given recent events. Friday. Gideon found her in the barn at 6:30 in the morning, attempting to muck out a stall by lamplight with a technique she'd developed from first principles, because she hadn't wanted to ask. He stood in the barn doorway for a moment, just watching. You're doing that wrong, he said. I know, Vivian said, without stopping. He came in and took the pitchfork from her and showed her the right angle, the right motion, the way to move the weight so your back didn't take all of it. He wasn't gentle about it. He wasn't the sort of man who is gentle about practical instruction. But he was clear, and he corrected her without contempt, which she appreciated more than she expected to. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. We've got 2 more stalls. Well, the community noticed her within days. Ridge Creek was not a large town. A general store, a smithy, a church, a saloon, a post office that doubled as the telegraph station, and perhaps 300 souls spread across the surrounding territory. And it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and everyone's business was, by unspoken communal agreement, everybody else's business too. The iron trunk had been talked about before Vivian finished unpacking. She heard it at the general store on her second Thursday, when she went in for flour and lamp oil, and a woman named Mrs. Harker, wide, watchful, the particular queen of small-town social intelligence, looked at Vivian's hands wrapping the purchase and said, without pretense, "That trunk of yours is quite something. Took 4 men to get it into the wagon, I heard." "It's a heavy trunk," Vivian said pleasantly. "What do you keep in it?" "My things." Mrs. Harker's eyes were quick and experienced. "Those are fine gloves for a ranch wife." Vivian smiled. "They were a gift." "From who?" "From someone who is no longer in my life. She paid for her flour and her lamp oil, and she walked out into the cold street, and she kept walking until she turned the corner and pressed her back against the exterior wall of the feed store and breathed, carefully, deliberately, the way she'd practiced, until the feeling passed that everyone in Ridge Creek could see straight through her. The rumors started that same week. She heard the first one from Elsie, who reported it with the guileless directness of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned that some information is offered as a weapon. "Martha Colby told her mother you were a criminal," Elsie said, looking up from the doll she was attempting to redress with the focused dedication of a surgeon. Vivian looked up from the bread dough she was kneading. "Did she?" "She said criminals come west to hide." Elsie looked at Vivian. "Are you a criminal?" "What do you think?" Elsie considered her doll for a moment. "I think Martha Colby has never been right about anything in her life," she said. "She told me snakes hibernate in chimneys, and I told Papa, and he said that was nonsense." Vivian felt something loosen in her chest. She turned back to the bread dough. "I'm not a criminal, Elsie." "I know," Elsie said simply, and went back to her doll. The second rumor reached Gideon via a neighbor named Cal Pritchard, who made it his personal mission to deliver information with maximum dramatic effect and minimum factual support. Vivian was washing dishes when Gideon came in from talking to Pritchard in the yard, and she could tell from the way he moved, careful, deliberate, the walk of a man choosing his words before he opened his mouth, that the conversation had not been about weather or cattle. He sat down at the table. She kept washing dishes. "Pritchard says there were 2 men asking questions about you in Cheyenne," Gideon said. "Asking the stage lines, the railways, about a woman traveling west alone with a big trunk." Vivian's hands didn't stop moving. "People ask questions," she said. "Who are they?" "I don't know who Pritchard's source is." "That's not what I asked you, Vivian." She set the dish down in the rack. She turned around. Gideon was sitting at the table with his hands flat on the wood, his eyes on her, and his expression was the particular expression of a man who was not angry yet, but was standing at the door of it. "There are people in my past," she said, "who are not happy with a decision I made." "What decision?" "I left." A silence. "Left what?" Gideon said. "A life I didn't choose." She looked at him steadily. "I am not a criminal. I have not hurt anyone. I am not dangerous to you or to Elsie. That is the truth, and I will swear it to you on anything you want to name." He studied her for a long time. She could see him weighing it, weighing her the way he'd weigh a piece of timber for soundness, looking for the places where it might crack under pressure. "Those are not small things to be asking me to take on faith," he said finally. "No," she agreed, "they're not. And you won't tell me more than that." "Not yet." The not yet surprised both of them, she thought. It acknowledged something, a future, a possibility that there would be a time when more was possible between them. She hadn't planned to say it. It slipped out from somewhere more honest than strategy. Gideon sat with that for a moment. Then he pushed back from the table and stood up. "I'll check the east fence line tomorrow," he said, which was not a response to anything she'd said, and was simultaneously exactly a response to everything she'd said. "It's been making trouble." He went back outside. Vivian turned back to the dishes. Her hands were steadier than she expected. 3 weeks into her time on the ranch, a hard frost came overnight and burst 2 of the water pipes in the kitchen, and Vivian spent the better part of a Tuesday on her knees on the kitchen floor, helping Gideon with a wrench and a bucket and a vocabulary she was fairly confident she'd never heard in any drawing room in Chicago. The work was unglamorous. Her hair came half down. She got water on her dress twice, and ice chips in her collar, and at one point she was holding a joint in place with both hands while Gideon worked around her and his elbow collided with her shoulder, and they were both wedged under the counter in an arrangement that would have been considered scandalous in any social context she'd previously inhabited. "Hold it steady," he said. "I am holding it steady." "You're letting it tilt. You're not giving me enough room to—" "Here." He repositioned her hands, not asking, just moving them with the efficiency of a man who knew what was required. And she felt the shape of his fingers over hers, rough and certain, and she thought, when was the last time anyone touched my hands like they were useful? Not to be held, not to be admired, not to demonstrate something about her status or his intentions, but simply because her hands were needed. The pipe held. She let out a breath. "Good," Gideon said, pulling back. "I thought you said I was letting it tilt." "You were. You fixed it." He sat back on his heels and looked at the joint. "It'll hold till spring. Then we'll do it right." Vivian sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and looked at her wet, cold hands with their slightly ink-stained fingers and the broken nail on her right thumb from the kindling incident, and thought that she'd never felt quite so far from who she'd been. She thought it in the best possible sense. It was the rag doll that changed something she couldn't name. The doll's name, she'd learned, was Margaret. Margaret had belonged to Elsie since she was 3, a gift from her mother in the last year before the fever took her, and she was consequently the most important object in the house, and possibly in the territory. Vivian was reaching for something on a high shelf in the front room on a Thursday afternoon, and her elbow caught the edge of the side table, and Margaret went off it and hit the floor, and the seam along Margaret's left side opened from shoulder to hip with a sound like a tiny, terrible finality. Vivian stood looking at the doll on the floor. She could hear Elsie outside. She could hear the sound of the girl playing in the yard, talking to herself the way children did, inventing whole worlds in the cold. She picked Margaret up very carefully. She found the sewing box. She found thread. And then she stood for a moment with the ordinary brown thread in her hand. And then she made a decision that she'd examine later with some surprise at herself. And she opened the trunk. She didn't take much. She never took much. Just a small length of thread she'd wound onto a card months ago and packed with a vague, inarticulate idea that beauty should be preserved even when beauty seemed impractical. It was golden. Not gold-colored, actual gold thread, the kind that had been woven through a particular piece of needlework that hung in her mother's bedroom when Vivian was small. She sat down in the chair by the window and she repaired Margaret with small, careful stitches, and the golden thread caught the afternoon light as her needle moved, and she was so absorbed in the work that she didn't hear Elsie come inside until the little girl stopped in the doorway and went absolutely still. Vivian looked up. Elsie was staring at Margaret with an expression that was equal parts horror at the damage and something trembling and fragile at the repair. "She fell," Vivian said quietly. "I'm fixing her." Elsie came closer, slowly, and Vivian held the doll up so the girl could see the stitching, golden thread and even lines along the seam, neat and bright and deliberate. "That's not regular thread," Elsie said. "No." "Where'd you get it?" Vivian hesitated for only a moment. "From my trunk." Elsie looked at her. "Why?" "Because Margaret deserves something better than ordinary." Vivian turned the doll over and made the last 3 stitches and bit the thread and smoothed the seam with her thumb. There's something in Japan, an art, a philosophy, about repairing broken things with gold. The idea is that the break becomes part of the history, that what's been mended with care is stronger and more beautiful than what was never broken at all. She handed Margaret back. Elsie took the doll and held her and looked at the golden seam for a long time without saying anything. Then she looked up at Vivian and said, "Mama broke her arm once. Her actual arm, when she was little. Papa said you could see where the bone grew back together on the picture the doctor took. He said it was stronger at the break than anywhere else." Vivian looked at this small, careful girl with her mother's doll in her father's eyes, and she felt something in her own chest that she recognized dimly as the particular ache of caring about someone you hadn't planned to care about. "Your father's a smart man," she said. "He's not always smart," Elsie said judiciously. "He walked into the same fence post twice last October." Vivian laughed. It came out unexpectedly, genuine and a little rusty, like a door opened after a long time unused. Elsie looked pleased with herself. Gideon found the documents by accident on a Friday evening in late February when he came inside earlier than expected. The cold had turned the cows difficult, and he'd given up on the evening feeding after an argument with the most stubborn animal on the property, and found the trunk open in the front room. Vivian was kneeling beside it. She'd been reorganizing things. She'd been reorganizing since Chicago, the way some people reorganize because they couldn't sit still. And she'd been careless for the first time since she'd arrived because she'd thought she had another hour before he'd come in from the barn. She heard his boots on the porch. She reached for the trunk lid, but she was too late, and she knew from the moment she looked up and saw his eyes that he'd already seen enough. Not everything. He couldn't have read anything from that distance. But he'd seen the seal on the topmost document, the formal, unmistakable impression of a Chicago legal firm that had a certain reputation, the kind of reputation that traveled even to Wyoming. And she watched him file that information away with the same quiet, measuring attention he applied to everything. She closed the trunk. He went to the kitchen and poured himself water from the jug. She stayed kneeling on the floor for a moment, recalibrating. "Gideon," she said. "It's not my business," he said from the kitchen. "I want you to know," she started. "Vivian." He came to the kitchen doorway and he looked at her with an expression that was harder to read than anger. Something more complicated than that. Something tired and careful. "I'm doing my best to take you at your word, that you're not dangerous, that you're not a criminal, that there's a reason you're here and it's not a bad one." He paused. "But I need you to understand, this isn't just about me. I have a daughter. Elsie has already started—" He stopped. "She's attached to you. If something comes here, if whoever is asking questions in Cheyenne finds their way to this ranch—" "They won't," Vivian said. "How do you know that?" "Because they don't think this is a place someone like me would go." She held his gaze. "They're looking in cities, in rail hubs, in the kind of places where people with resources go when they run." She spread her hands, those useful, increasingly roughened hands. "No one looks in Wyoming for the kind of person I used to be." The silence stretched between them. "What kind of person did you used to be?" Gideon said quietly. Vivian looked at him across the front room of this listing, labor-filled, impractical, absolutely wonderful house, and she thought about the chandelier and the wallpaper and the legal documents spread across a mahogany table in the office of a man named Hargreaves, who had looked at her with cold, specific authority and said, "You will sign this or I will ensure you sign nothing ever again." "Someone with a great deal less sense than she has now," she said. Gideon looked at her for another moment. He nodded once, slowly, and went back to the kitchen. She sat on the floor beside the trunk and breathed and counted, and somewhere in the house she could hear Elsie talking to Margaret in the quiet, authoritative tone she used when conducting important negotiations with her doll. And Vivian pressed her palm flat against the cold iron of the trunk lid and thought, "Not yet, but soon. When the ground is steadier, when I am steadier, when I know if what is building here can hold the weight of the truth." Outside, the wind picked up across the Wyoming plain, rattling the window glass in its frame. The sky to the northwest had gone the particular dark color that the territory used as a warning, heavy and iron gray, and entirely without mercy. Inside, the lamp burned. The doll with her golden seam sat propped against the wall on Elsie's chair. And Vivian Blackwood, who was not a homesteader, had never been a homesteader, had never split wood or mucked a stall or repaired a pipe in all her previous life, got up off the floor and went to help with supper. She was getting better at the porridge. It wasn't much. It wasn't the whole truth. But it was something real, and in a life that had recently contained very little that was real, she held on to it with both hands. March came in like something personally offended by the existence of warmth. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees overnight, and the creek at the east edge of the Ashcroft property froze solid enough that Gideon walked across it on Thursday morning to check the fence line and didn't fall through, which he took as a small mercy in a month that had not offered many. Vivian had been on the ranch for 5 weeks. In 5 weeks, she had burned exactly 4 meals, down from an early average of 1 per day, split her thumb open twice, learned the particular rhythm of the morning chores, and developed what could only be described as a complicated relationship with the gray mare in the second stall, who had decided that Vivian was acceptable but not enthusiastically so, and made this clear by occasionally accepting offered apples, and occasionally just staring at the apple with contempt. She was learning. That was the thing Gideon hadn't entirely prepared himself for. Not the mistakes, which he'd expected, but the learning, the specific quality of her attention when she didn't know how to do something. Most people, when faced with a task they couldn't do, either pretended they could or gave up. Vivian did neither. She watched. She asked specific, practical questions with no embarrassment attached to the asking. She failed, and then she adjusted, and then she failed differently, and then she adjusted again until the thing was done. He'd watched her spend 40 minutes one morning figuring out the correct way to store the cured pork so it wouldn't go bad before spring, cross-referencing what he'd told her against what she'd apparently been reading in a homesteading manual she'd somehow produced from inside the trunk. And he thought, against his own intentions, she's going to be fine out here. And then he'd gone back to work before the thought could settle into something more specific than that. The town, meanwhile, had not made peace with her existence. Ridge Creek in winter was a community turned inward on itself. All the normal routes of gossip compressed by cold into something denser and more fermented. People who might have let a rumor pass in July held on to it in February like it was the only interesting thing available, which it frequently was. And Vivian, with her expensive gloves and her mysterious trunk, and the two men who'd supposedly been asking questions in Cheyenne, was genuinely the most interesting thing to arrive in Ridge Creek since the saloon fire of 1889. Mrs. Harker had appointed herself the administrative center of community suspicion, and she conducted her intelligence operations through the general store with the focused efficiency of a professional. By mid-March, she had assembled and distributed a narrative in which Vivian was variously a con woman who'd swindled a railroad executive, a woman escaping a murder charge in 3 separate states, the number increasing with each retelling, and in one particularly creative version that had reached Gideon via Cal Pritchard, a foreign spy. Though Pritchard couldn't identify the country in question. Spy, Gideon had said flatly when Pritchard delivered this last one. I'm just telling you what I heard. You hear a lot, Cal. I hear what's true too sometimes, Pritchard said, with the particular dignity of a man who knew he was mostly wrong but retained hopes of eventual vindication. Gideon hadn't responded to that. He'd finished nailing the fence post he was working on and gone back to the barn and stood there for a while in the smell of horses and straw, thinking about legal seals and iron trunks and a woman who'd said not yet like it was a promise. He didn't think she was a spy. He also knew that the things he didn't think about a person weren't the same as the things he knew about them, and those were not the same as the things that were actually true, and somewhere in that gap between thinking and knowing and truth was every mistake he'd made in his life. He nailed the next post harder than necessary. It was Elsie who was the unexpected complication in all of this. Gideon had prepared himself to manage his daughter's expectations, to have a quiet conversation, when the time came, about not getting too attached, about the fact that this arrangement was new and uncertain. He'd prepared the words. He'd known he'd need them eventually. He'd never gotten to use them. Elsie had attached herself to Vivian with the same calm certainty that she applied to all her major decisions, which was to say she had assessed the situation thoroughly and then simply proceeded, without drama or announcement, as though the outcome had always been obvious. She brought Vivian things she thought were important, the interesting rock she'd found by the creek, the bird feather she'd saved since October, the explanation of why Martha Colby was wrong about basically everything. She sat next to Vivian at supper. She'd started requesting that Vivian braid her hair in the mornings, which was something Gideon had never quite mastered and had felt guilty about, and which Vivian had taken on without comment, sitting behind Elsie on the bench by the window and working through the tangles with patient, unpracticed hands that were getting more practiced every day. He didn't know how to feel about that. He'd decided, provisionally, to feel grateful rather than complicated about it, and mostly that worked. It was a Wednesday in mid-March when Vivian came back from the general store, looking like someone had said exactly what she'd been afraid they'd say. She didn't tell him immediately. She came in, put the flour and the coffee and the lamp oil away in the correct places. She'd stopped putting things in the wrong places around week 3. And she put on the kettle and she sat down at the table with her hands wrapped around a mug and her eyes on the surface of the table. Gideon had learned to read her silences. This one was not the comfortable kind. What happened? He said. It wasn't a question. Vivian looked up. Mrs. Harker had a letter today from a legal firm in Cheyenne. She paused. She was showing it around the store. The letter asked if anyone in the Ridge Creek area had come into contact with a woman matching a particular description traveling with substantial luggage. Gideon set down the harness he'd been mending. She showed it to you? She showed it to the store. I was in the store. Vivian looked at him steadily, and he could see the effort in it, the particular work of looking calm when you weren't. She didn't say anything directly to me, but everyone in that store saw the letter and then looked at me. What firm? Vivian was quiet for a moment. Vivian. Crane and Aldis, she said. Out of Chicago originally. They have a Cheyenne office now. Gideon had heard of Crane and Aldis. You didn't need to have any particular knowledge of Chicago law to have heard of Crane and Aldis. Their reputation had traveled west with the railways, attached to a specific kind of client, the kind that had enough money to make legal pressure feel like weather, like something you simply had to endure. He picked the harness back up. Put it down again. They're looking for you, he said. Yes. On behalf of who? She wrapped her hands tighter around the mug. My uncle, she said. His name is Harlan Blackwood. It was the first time she'd given him a name that connected to her, something specific, something real. He felt the weight of it, the gesture it represented, the small opening of a door she'd been keeping shut. What does he want? Gideon said carefully. What he's always wanted, control of what my father left. She looked up at the kitchen window, at the gray March sky pressing against the glass. My father built an industrial company from nothing, 30 years of work. When he died, he left it to me, his only child. Her voice was level, precise, the voice of someone who'd gone over these facts enough times that they'd lost the power to break her open anymore. My uncle contested the will. When that failed, he arranged for 2 physicians, both of whom owed him considerable money, to sign documents declaring me mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. The legal mechanism exists. It doesn't require much. Just 2 signatures and a sympathetic judge, and a woman's property becomes someone else's to manage. Gideon said nothing. He was watching her face. He also arranged a marriage, she continued, to a man named Fitzwilliam Coates, who was a business partner of my uncle's, and who looked at me the way a person looks at a property they're about to acquire. She said it without visible anger, which was somehow worse than anger. The wedding was scheduled for April the 14th. When did you leave? March the 2nd. He did the calculation without meaning to. 11 days on the train. She'd arrived here on the 13th. If she'd stayed, she'd be 6 weeks from a wedding she hadn't agreed to. The trunk, he said. She met his eyes. Yes. That's why it's so heavy. Yes. He waited. I spent 3 months converting everything I could into portable form, she said. Bank instruments, legal documents establishing my own ownership, enough to rebuild from, if it came to that. My father's company is still running, still profitable. My uncle is operating it as though the question of ownership is already settled. The documents in the trunk say otherwise. She paused. I didn't run because I was helpless. I ran because fighting in Chicago, on his ground, through his courts, with his judges, I would have lost. Not because the law was against me, because the power was. The kitchen was very quiet except for the wind outside, and the small sound of the kettle beginning to think about boiling. Gideon looked at this woman sitting at his kitchen table with her scarred thumb and her ink-stained fingers and her careful, exhausted dignity. And he thought about the gap between what he'd imagined when he'd sent that letter to the matrimonial agency and what was actually sitting across from him. He'd wanted practical. He'd wanted simple. He'd wanted someone who'd fit into the shape of the life he'd built without complicating it. What he had was considerably more complicated. He was not, he was discovering, as bothered by that as he'd expected to be. Crane and Aldis send a letter to a general store in Ridge Creek. Everyone in town's going to know your business by Sunday, he said, finally. I know. If men come here, I'll deal with it. You'll deal with it, he repeated. I've been dealing with it for 3 months. I'm better at it than I look. Something crossed her face, not quite humor, but adjacent to it, tired and self-aware. I know I don't look like much of a threat. You look like someone who got frostbite learning to feed horses, he said. Doesn't mean you're not capable. She blinked. He wasn't sure why he'd said that. It was true, which was the best reason he had. She looked at the table again. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I knew there was a risk, that they might track this far. I believed the risk was small, and I believed that if it materialized, I could manage it without it becoming your problem. It's my property they'd be coming to." "Yes." "My daughter lives here." "Yes." Her voice was flat with something that wasn't quite guilt but lived in the same neighborhood. "I know that." Gideon stood up from the table. He went to the window and looked out at the gray afternoon, at the fence posts running in their uneven line toward the creek, at the barn and the smokehouse and all the physical components of a life he'd spent 14 years building in the frozen middle of nowhere. "I'm not throwing you out," he said. He felt more than saw the small release in her, the exhale, the fractional shift of her shoulders. "I'm not saying that because—" He stopped. Tried again. "You haven't lied to me. You've withheld things, which is different. And you fixed the pipe, and you're getting better at the porridge, and Elsie—" He ran a hand over the back of his neck. "Elsie would not forgive me. You shouldn't make decisions based on a 7-year-old. I make decisions based on whatever's in front of me. Right now, that's a woman who fixed my daughter's doll with gold thread and my pipes with a wrench, and who apparently walked away from a fortune because she didn't like the terms attached to it." He turned from the window. "If men come from Crane and Aldous, I will handle it. This is my property, and you are my—" He stopped again. The word hung between them, uncertain of its own weight. "Your what?" she said. He looked at her. "My responsibility," he said. It wasn't the word he'd started to say. She knew that. He could see that she knew it, but she nodded, slowly, and she wrapped her hands back around the mug, and the kettle came properly to a boil, and neither of them said anything more about it. It was Elsie who broke the silence, coming in from the back room with Margaret tucked under her arm, and a look of determination that meant she'd made a decision about something. She looked from Vivian to her father and back, with the particular acuity of a child who is accustomed to reading the emotional temperature of a room. "Are you having an argument?" she asked. "No," Gideon said. Elsie looked at Vivian. "Are you staying?" Vivian looked at Gideon for just a moment, a quick, sideways glance that was gone before he could decide what was in it. "Yes," she said. "I'm staying." Elsie nodded as though this confirmed what she'd already established in her own mind, and climbed up onto the bench beside Vivian and opened a book she'd brought in from the back room and began to read, or to pretend to read, in the comfortable way of children who simply want to be near an adult they've decided to trust. The kitchen settled back into its ordinary sounds, the fire, the wind, the creak of the house adjusting to the cold, and Vivian sat with Elsie's warm weight against her side and thought about the word responsibility and all the ways a word could mean more than it said. Outside, 2 ravens landed on the fence post nearest the house, sat for a moment, and flew away. The sky to the northwest was darkening in the way that, in Wyoming, meant something was coming. It always did. The sky had been lying for 3 days. It sat low and pale over the territory, the kind of colorless white that looked like nothing was coming when experienced ranchers knew it meant everything was coming. Gideon had read that sky on Monday morning and said nothing to Vivian about it because saying something would have made it more real, and there was still the east pasture fence to mend and 2 calves that needed watching and a dozen other tasks that didn't stop for weather that hadn't arrived yet. By Wednesday, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees since sunrise, and the horses were restless in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. "Storm," Gideon said at supper, stating it plainly, the way he said most things. "Tonight or tomorrow morning." Vivian looked up from the bread she was cutting. "How bad?" "Bad enough." He looked at Elsie. "You stay inside tomorrow. No arguments." Elsie opened her mouth. "No arguments," he said again, and she closed it. They spent that evening preparing with the focused, wordless efficiency that the ranch had developed over the past weeks. Gideon bringing extra firewood onto the porch and into the mudroom, Vivian filling every pot and basin with water from the pump before it could freeze, both of them moving around each other in the kitchen and the mudroom and the back porch without collision, without needing to negotiate space. It was the kind of coordination that develops between people who've shared a working space long enough that they've stopped thinking about it. Neither of them remarked on it. Remarking on it would have required acknowledging it, and they were both, in their different ways, still being careful about what they acknowledged. Elsie fell asleep in the chair by the fire with Margaret on her chest, which was where she'd been sleeping more and more often since the temperature dropped, finding the chair warmer than her upstairs room. Vivian carried her up without waking her, which Gideon watched from the doorway of the kitchen. This woman who'd never been a mother, carrying his daughter with the particular carefulness of someone who understood the weight of the thing they were holding. He went back to stacking wood. The storm arrived at 4 in the morning. Gideon heard it before he felt it, a sound like the world clearing its throat. And then the full force of it hit the north wall of the house, and the windows rattled in their frames, and the fire in the kitchen stove surged and then dropped, and the temperature in the bedroom fell noticeably in the space of 60 seconds. He was dressed and downstairs by 4:15, which was when he heard the cattle. He stood in the kitchen listening to the sound they were making, not the ordinary protest of cold animals, but something higher and more urgent, the sound of animals in genuine distress. And he made the calculation that a rancher makes and has always made, the one between safety and livelihood, between the sensible choice and the only choice that his particular kind of man could actually live with. He put on every layer he owned. He was pulling on his outer coat when Vivian appeared at the top of the stairs, already dressed, already awake, her hair down and her expression sharp with the specific alertness of someone who'd heard the same sounds and made the same calculation and arrived at the bottom of it a step behind him. "You're not going out there," she said. "I have to get the cattle into the lower barn." "Gideon, if I lose those cattle, I lose the spring income and half of next winter's." He pulled his coat closed. "I'll be an hour." She looked at him. He could see her adding things up, the sound of the wind outside, which was now the kind of sound that made the house feel small, the darkness, the temperature, his expression, which he knew was the expression of a man who'd made a decision and wasn't interested in having it unmade. "Take the guide rope," she said. He stopped. The guide rope was a length of heavy line he kept coiled by the back door specifically for bad storms, a safety line you could tie from the house to the barn so you didn't lose your direction in a whiteout. He'd used it twice in 14 years. He'd walked past it when he put his coat on without thinking about it, which told him something about his own state of mind that he didn't have time to examine right now. He took the rope. "An hour," he said. "If I'm not back in an hour—" "You'll be back in an hour," she said flatly, like she was refusing the alternative on principle. He went out the back door into something that was no longer weather in any comfortable sense of the word. It was a physical force, a sustained assault, the wind hitting him with a pressure that wasn't cold so much as it was intent. The visibility was already near zero. He could see the rope in his hand and approximately 4 feet of snow-filled darkness beyond it and nothing else. He tied one end to the porch railing and moved toward the barn by feel and memory and the rope feeding out behind him. He got the cattle moved. It took longer than an hour, closer to 90 minutes, working in conditions where even the familiar geography of his own property felt treacherous and strange, where the distance between the house and the barn became something he had to navigate with total concentration, where once he lost his footing on ice beneath the snow and went down hard on one knee and stayed there for a moment, breathing and recalculating. He was on his way back, following the rope home, when the horse found him. Later, he wouldn't be entirely clear on the sequence of events. The storm scrambled the timeline in his memory, the way intense cold and disorientation will do. What he knew was this. He was moving along the rope and the wind shifted and he heard something to his left that was wrong, a sound from the wrong direction, and he turned toward it and the ground was suddenly not where he expected it to be, and he went into the ravine sideways, which was mercy of a kind because sideways was better than straight down, and the horse, the gray gelding that must have gotten out of the paddock in the chaos, came down on top of him. Not fully. If it had been fully, he wouldn't have been conscious to care about it. The horse's weight came across his left leg and his left hip, and the sound that came out of him when it did was something he'd be embarrassed about if he ever told this story, which he didn't plan to. The horse scrambled up and was gone into the white darkness, and Gideon was in a snow-filled ravine with his left leg pinned under nothing now but his own inability to make it move correctly, and the wind pressing down on him like something trying to make a decision, and the rope gone from his hand somewhere in the fall. He wasn't panicking. Panic was a luxury. He was doing the inventory that a man does when he's in serious trouble. What works? What doesn't? What options exist? Which of those options are real? The inventory wasn't encouraging. His left leg was either broken or badly enough damaged to accomplish the same result in the short term. The temperature was somewhere that the body didn't tolerate for very long. He didn't know how deep in the ravine he was or how far from the rope. He shouted once, and the wind took the sound and did what the wind does. He thought about Elsie asleep in the chair with her doll. He started trying to dig himself out. Vivian had been counting minutes since the door closed behind him. She'd stood at the kitchen window watching the back porch disappear into white nothing, and she'd counted, not in any organized way, not the careful counting she used to manage her own fear, but the involuntary counting of a person doing the only thing available to them. She'd kept the stove burning. She'd checked on Elsie twice. She'd stood at the back door and listened to the storm and heard nothing that was Gideon coming back. At 93 minutes, she put on her coat. At 94 minutes, she put on his spare coat over hers, because she didn't have one heavy enough for what she was looking at, and 2 coats was better than 1, and warmth mattered more than dignity. At 95 minutes, she tied herself to the porch railing with the second length of rope from the hook by the door. A shorter rope, not long enough to reach the barn. But she wasn't going to the barn, she was going to where the first rope ended, and then she was going to follow the first rope and find him, or find where the rope ended and shout until someone heard her. She went out into the storm. The world outside the door was not a place anymore. It was a condition, a continuous, featureless, freezing assault on every sense simultaneously. She couldn't see. She could barely hear over the wind. She moved by feel, hand over hand along the porch railing and then along the guide rope where it stretched away from the house into the white, and she talked to herself under her breath, the way she'd talked to herself in the Chicago townhouse the night she'd packed the trunk. A continuous, low internal monologue that wasn't prayer and wasn't courage exactly, but was the voice of a person refusing to let the body stop moving. One hand, then the other hand. The rope is in your left hand. The rope is in your left hand. She was 30 feet from the house when she found where the guide rope ended. Not at the barn, but in midair, the cut end swinging in the wind, frayed and wrong. It must have come loose in the storm, which meant he'd been navigating without it for however long he'd been out here. She stood in nothing and thought. He'd gone toward the cattle. The cattle were in the lower barn, which was north-northeast of the house. If something had happened to him, it would have happened between here and there. She turned herself north-northeast by the compass of the wind direction. She'd learned compass directions from the storm itself, the way the prevailing wind always came from the northwest, which meant if the wind was hitting her right cheek, she was facing northeast, approximately. She went north-northeast. She shouted his name 3 times. The wind ate the sound. She shouted it again anyway. She nearly fell into the ravine herself, which would have been the end of both of them. Her right foot went over the edge and she lurched back hard and stood there with her heart slamming against her sternum and her lungs burning from cold and the sudden rush of survival instinct. And she looked down into the dark below the edge of the drop and shouted his name again. This time something came back, not words, just sound. A rough, directed, deliberate sound. A man making as much noise as he could manage with a crushed chest and frozen hands, but aimed toward the voice he'd heard, and she followed that sound down the side of the ravine on her hands and knees, with the snow filling her collar and her gloves shredding on the frozen ground underneath. And she found him. He was half buried. His left leg was at an angle that made her stomach drop, and she didn't look at it again, just looked at his face. Conscious, gray, the focused expression of a man who'd been doing the arithmetic of his own survival and had been coming up short. "I've got you," she said. "My leg. I see it. Can you move your foot?" A pause. "Yes." "Then it's not broken, or not completely." She didn't know if that was medically accurate. She'd said it because it was the useful thing to say. "Can you sit up?" He got himself up with her pulling on his arm, and she could feel the effort it cost him, the way he went white around the mouth, and said nothing because saying something would have used energy he needed. She looked at the ravine wall above them, maybe 8 feet, steep, iced over, and she was already exhausted and her hands were past the point of reliable sensation. She thought about what she had, the rope around her waist, still tied to the porch railing, which meant if they could get up the wall, the rope would lead them home. "I need you to try to stand," she said. "I'm not sure I—" "Try." He tried. He got partway up and the leg buckled and she caught him with both arms around his torso and they stood there in the bottom of the frozen ravine in the dark and the wind, her holding most of his weight. Neither of them saying anything for a moment because neither of them had anything useful to say. "The rope around my waist goes back to the house," she said. "If we get up this wall, we can follow it home. I need you to help me as much as you can." He looked at her. She could see him making the same calculation he'd made in the kitchen earlier, assessing what was real and what wasn't, what options existed. She watched him find the same answer she had. "All right," he said. Getting up the ravine wall took longer than she would be able to accurately account for afterward. What she remembered was the specific quality of it. Not dramatic, not heroic in any clean sense, just brutal and incremental and ugly. She went up first and found handholds in the frozen earth, and she pulled and he pushed with his good leg, and they stopped twice because he needed to, and she made no comment about the stopping. Her coat tore on something, and the cold got in immediately, and she kept moving. He slipped on the iced-over section near the top and grabbed her arm, and for a moment they both hung there, 3 feet from the edge. And she thought very calmly, "I will not let go." She did not let go. They made the top. They lay in the snow for 30 seconds, she counted, before she made herself stand up and pull on his arm. "Up," she said. "We're not done." "Give me up, Gideon." She got her hands under his arms. "Stand up and hold the rope and walk. You can feel sorry for yourself inside." He made a sound that was either a laugh or a curse, she wasn't sure which, and he stood. She found the rope at her waist, and she put his hands on it, and she kept one arm around him, and they walked back through the nothing in the direction of the house, following the line. And the wind pushed against them the whole way, like it had made a personal decision about this. And she talked continuously. Not to him exactly, just into the storm, maintaining the thread of her own consciousness, the low-running commentary that kept her feet moving when moving seemed like an unreasonable request. The porch light appeared out of the white like a rumor, then a fact. And then Vivian's knees found the porch steps, and she went down on them hard enough to feel it through both coats, and she didn't care, because they were home, and the door was right there, and Gideon was still upright and still holding the rope and still breathing. She got the door open. The warmth of the kitchen hit them both like a blow. Elsie was standing in the middle of the kitchen floor in her nightgown, with Margaret clutched to her chest and her eyes enormous, and she looked at her father and then at Vivian, and then at her father again, and she said, in a voice that was very small and very controlled for a 7-year-old who had clearly been awake and alone and terrified, "I heard you go out." "It's all right," Vivian said, though her voice came out rougher than she intended, scraped by cold and exertion. "He's all right. We're both all right." Elsie looked at Vivian's hands, shredded gloves, bleeding palms, the dark red of cold-damaged skin. She looked at her father's face, at the gray still in it, the leg he wasn't putting full weight on. "You went out in the storm," Elsie said, and it was directed at Vivian. "Yes." Elsie's chin wobbled once, precisely once, and then she squared her small jaw and went to the fire to add wood to it, because she was Gideon Ashcroft's daughter, and she knew what needed doing, and she did it. Gideon sat in the chair and said nothing for a long time. Vivian stood at the kitchen counter unwrapping her hands and not looking at him because she was very tired and her hands hurt badly and she didn't trust what her face was doing. "You went out after me," he said finally. "Yes, alone, in that storm. You had been gone an hour and a half." She found the cloth she wanted and pressed it to her palm. "Someone had to." He was quiet again. She could feel him looking at her. She kept her attention on her hands. "Vivienne," he said. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the careful, measuring look, not the deliberate neutrality he kept between them like a rule. Something had come unguarded in it. Something that looked, if she was being honest with herself, a great deal like the way she'd felt standing in the bottom of that ravine deciding she was not going to let go of him. "Thank you," he said. Just that. Simple, direct, the way he said everything. She nodded, turned back to her hands. Outside, the blizzard made its case against the walls of the house with everything it had, and the house held and the fire burned, and Elsie sat on the floor between the chair and the counter, close enough to touch both of them, and said nothing, which was exactly right. The storm blew itself out by Friday morning, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like a different kind of noise. Gideon's leg was badly bruised from hip to knee, the muscle damaged in a way that made walking a negotiation rather than an automatic act. The ranch doctor, a lean, unhurried man named Pratt, who'd been practicing in Ridge Creek for 20 years and had seen more storm injuries than he cared to count, came out Saturday afternoon and pressed along the bone and declared nothing broken, which he said with the mild satisfaction of a man confirming his own diagnosis. He strapped the leg, told Gideon to stay off it for 2 weeks, and looked at Vivian's hands with slightly more concern. "You went out in that," he said. It wasn't a question. "He needed getting," she said. Pratt looked at her palms. The rope burns, the split skin along 3 fingers, the frostbite blistering across the back of her right hand. He cleaned and wrapped them without comment, which she appreciated. He was the kind of man who understood that some decisions didn't need to be evaluated after the fact. "Keep these dry for a week," he said. "Change the dressings every morning. If the blistering spreads, send for me." He left. Gideon, sitting at the kitchen table with his leg propped on a second chair because Vivian had told him to keep it elevated and he'd been too tired to argue, watched her begin immediately trying to use her wrapped hands to peel potatoes for supper. "Stop," he said. "I'm fine." "You're going to tear the dressings." "The dressings will be fine, Vivian." His voice had the particular quality it got when he was choosing to be patient about something that was trying that patience considerably. "Sit down." She set the potato down. She sat down. She looked at her wrapped hands for a moment, then at him. "I'm not good at not doing things," she said. "I noticed that about you early on," he said. Something that was almost a smile crossed her face, and she let her hands rest on the table. And for a while they sat in the kitchen with the post-storm quiet around them and the fire doing its work. And it was the most peaceful the house had been in a week. Elsie came in from the back room where she'd been feeding the kitchen cat, an animal of uncertain age and strong opinions that had arrived at the ranch 2 winters ago and simply stayed. And she looked at the unpeeled potatoes and looked at Vivian's hands and looked at her father's leg and then went and got the peeling knife herself without being asked. Neither adult said anything about this. Elsie was a quick study. The news of what had happened spread through Ridge Creek the way all news spread in Ridge Creek, which was rapidly and with embellishment, though in this particular case the embellishment was barely necessary because the actual events were already sufficiently dramatic. By Sunday, when the roads were passable enough for neighbors to travel, 3 families had appeared at the Ashcroft Ranch with food: a ham from the Connolly place, 2 jars of preserved peaches from the Widow Marsh, a loaf of bread from a young couple named Birch, who'd only been in the territory 8 months and still had the hopeful look of people who hadn't yet experienced a second winter. They came, all of them, with their food and their condolences and their carefully neutral expressions that couldn't quite conceal the recalibration happening behind their eyes. They'd heard about the trunk and the legal letters and the men asking questions in Cheyenne. They'd heard Mrs. Harker's various narratives. They'd decided, as communities tend to do, that a woman who could do what this woman had done in the blizzard deserved a provisional extension of trust, whatever the truth of the rest of it. Vivian received them all at the door with her wrapped hands and her composure and offered them coffee. Because there was coffee, because she'd made sure there was always coffee now, and she thanked each of them with the kind of directness that didn't perform gratitude but simply expressed it. Cal Pritchard came on Tuesday. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and he looked at a point approximately 6 inches to the left of Vivian's face and said, "I may have repeated some things I shouldn't have repeated." "You may have," Vivian agreed. "I didn't know what you were." He shifted his weight. "I still don't know exactly what you are, but I know what you did, and I wanted to say I was wrong to talk the way I did." It was, she recognized, a significant thing for a man like Pritchard. It cost him something. "Thank you, Cal," she said, and meant it. Mrs. Harker did not come, but the letter from Crane and Aldous disappeared from conversation the same week, quietly, the way things disappear in small communities when the community has collectively decided to stop discussing them. Gideon noticed this. He didn't comment on it, but he noticed. He was noticing a great deal of things that week, which he attributed to being largely stationary for the first time in years. When you couldn't move, you watched. And what he was watching, From his chair at the kitchen table with his leg elevated and his coffee cup perpetually refilled by either Vivian or Elsie in a tag team arrangement that had organized itself without discussion, was a version of his own household he hadn't entirely seen while he was moving through it. He watched Vivian teach Elsie to write the letter Q, which Elsie found philosophically objectionable for reasons she explained at length. He watched Vivian listen to the explanation with genuine interest rather than parental tolerance, and then make an argument for the letter Q that incorporated Elsie's specific objections and resolved them. And he thought, where did she learn to talk to children like that? He watched her carry the workload of the ranch, those first 4 days when he was completely off his feet, with the help of a neighboring boy named Thomas who came by mornings. She directed Thomas with clear, practical instructions and no condescension, which was notable because Thomas was 15 and condescension was frequently irresistible with 15-year-olds. She made decisions about the cattle rotation, about the feed ratios, about which fence needed attention first when the snow cleared, and she made them correctly, which told him she'd been paying more attention to the workings of this place than he'd realized. She'd been learning, not just the tasks, the whole thing, the logic of it, the seasonal reasoning, the way each part of the ranch connected to every other part. She'd been absorbing it quietly while he thought she was just managing each day. On Thursday evening, 4 days after the storm, he said, "Come sit down." She was at the counter. She turned and looked at him. "Not because anything's wrong," he said. "Just come sit." She sat across from him at the table. Elsie was already in bed. She'd started going to bed at a reasonable hour, something that had mysteriously reformed itself in the past 2 weeks, and Vivian had not admitted that this correlated with a conversation she'd had with Elsie about sleep and growing and the specific biology of how bones extended, a conversation that had clearly landed with more authority than any amount of parental instruction. Gideon looked at this woman across the table from him. The lamplight was doing what lamplight does in winter kitchens, which is to say, making everything look warmer and more true than the daylight managed. "Tell me the rest of it," he said. Vivian was quiet for a moment. "There's quite a bit of rest," she said. "I've got a bad leg and nowhere to be." She looked at her wrapped hands on the table. Then she looked at him, and something in her face settled. The particular settling of someone who has been holding a position for so long they've forgotten what it feels like to put it down. "My father's name was Edmund Blackwood," she said. "He was not a sentimental man. He was practical and demanding, and he had very specific ideas about most things, and most of his specific ideas were correct, which made him difficult to argue with. He built Blackwood Industrial from a single ironworks in Cincinnati into something that operated in 11 states." She paused. "He didn't believe in leaving things to chance, including me." "He raised you to run it," Gideon said. "He raised me to understand it," she corrected. "Every summer from the time I was 12, I spent 6 weeks in the company offices. Not as a visitor, as a working presence. He had me in the accounting rooms, the legal offices, the factory floors. He wanted me to know what it was." She was quiet for a moment. "He was sick for the last 2 years of his life. I ran the company during that time, with his guidance. When he died, the transition to my sole management was not a surprise to anyone who'd been paying attention." "Except your uncle," Gideon said. "My uncle had paid attention to different things," she said. "Harlan was my father's younger brother, and he had the specific resentment of a man who'd been in proximity to power his whole life without ever quite having it. He had a position in the company, a comfortable one, well compensated. But he had no authority, and he knew it, and he'd spent 30 years making peace with that, or appearing to." She pressed her wrapped fingers flat on the table. "When my father died, Harlan appeared to be grieving. He was the first one at the house. He organized the funeral arrangements. He was present, kind even. And then 6 weeks later, his solicitors filed a challenge to the will." Her voice had gone level in the way it went level when she was recounting things that had been processed past the point of fresh pain. "When the challenge failed, he escalated. The physicians he arranged were men who owed him money. One of them I'd met socially. He'd been to the house for dinner. I'd thought him a decent man. The documents they signed declared me emotionally unstable, prone to irrational decision-making, unfit to manage significant assets." She paused. "The judge who reviewed those documents was a man named Carver. He hunted with my uncle every November." Gideon said nothing. He was watching her with his direct, unhurried attention. The marriage was Harlan's insurance, she said. Fitzwilliam Coates was his business partner and his instrument. If I married Coates, my assets transferred to marital management, which meant, in practical terms, Coates's management, which meant Harlan's management. The mental incompetency declaration would have been quietly dropped because it would no longer have been necessary. She looked at the lamp flame for a moment. Coates was not a violent man. He was simply a man who'd agreed to acquire something as a business transaction. I don't think he thought about me as a person at all, particularly. I was a line item. You had no one who could help you fight it, Gideon said. In Chicago, I had solicitors. Good ones. But Harlan had the judge, and without the judge, the solicitors were producing very expensive paper. She shook her head. I thought for weeks about staying, about fighting it through. And then I sat in my father's study one evening and I thought about all the years it would take, and all the ways it could go wrong and all the ground I'd already lost. And I thought, what would my father do if the ground was this badly compromised? She almost smiled. He would not have stayed and fought fair. He was not a man who fought fair when fighting fair meant losing. So you converted the assets. Over 3 months, quietly, carefully, through 4 different financial intermediaries because Harlan had people watching the main accounts. Bank instruments, bearer bonds, legal documents establishing my ownership of the company that predate any of Harlan's filings, documents that, in a jurisdiction with a judge who hasn't hunted with my uncle, would end the question of ownership definitively. She looked at him. All of it is in the trunk. Gideon sat with that for a moment. He thought about the weight of the thing. 4 men straining to load it onto the wagon, the platform shuddering when it came down. He'd known it wasn't just clothing. He hadn't known it was a fortune portable enough to carry across a continent. How much? He said. Not asking for a number exactly. Asking, he realized, something more like how different does this make things? Vivian understood the question. Enough that I don't need anything from you, she said plainly. Enough that I never needed anything from you except what you gave me without knowing it. Somewhere Harlan wouldn't think to look. He looked, Gideon said. The letter to Mrs. Harker. He looked in the obvious places. Cheyenne, Laramie, the rail towns. She shook her head. A matrimonial agency advertisement in the Prairie Hearth Gazette is not where a man like Harlan Blackwood looks for a woman like me. He's looking in hotels and cities and the homes of family friends. Something came into her expression, not quite satisfaction, but the particular quality of a decision that had been correct. He'll look for years if he has to. That's who he is. And when you feel safe enough, Gideon said. What then? The question sat between them. Vivian looked at the table. She looked at her wrapped hands. She looked at him. I haven't thought that far, she said, which was not entirely true and which she suspected he knew wasn't entirely true. She had thought that far. She'd thought past it, around it, through it on cold mornings when she was doing the chores before dawn and the ranch was quiet and the thinking had its own space. She just never said any of those thoughts out loud because saying them out loud made them into something she'd have to account for. Gideon nodded slowly, the nod of a man who accepts an incomplete answer because he understands something more complete isn't available yet. The documents, he said after a moment. Your ownership claim. A jurisdiction with the right judge. He looked at her steadily. Wyoming's a territory, not a state. Federal courts here aren't Carver's courts. She went very still. He wasn't a lawyer. He hadn't said it like a lawyer. He'd said it like a man who'd been sitting with a problem and had noticed something, the way he noticed things about fence lines and cattle and weather, practically without drama. I know, she said quietly. You've known since you came here. A pause. I thought about it, but you weren't ready. No. He looked at the lamp again. She watched him working through something. She'd learned to recognize the quality of his silence that meant he was thinking versus the silence that meant he'd decided and was waiting for the moment to say it. There's a federal circuit judge, he said finally. Comes through Ridge Creek every April for the territorial court session. Man named Alderman. He's not from here, rides the whole territory circuit 3 times a year. I've known him 12 years. He paused. He's not a man who hunts with anyone. The kitchen was very quiet. Vivian felt something shift in her chest. Not dramatically, nothing like a revelation, more like a door that had been stuck for months, moving a quarter inch on its hinges, a quarter inch of possible. "You do that," she said. "Introduce me." "I'd mention I had a situation that needed a fair review," he said. "What you do with that is your business." She looked at him across the table. This difficult, weathered, consistently underestimated man who'd ordered a wife the way you'd order fence posts and gotten something he hadn't known to want, and who was now sitting with a damaged leg in his own kitchen, offering her the only thing that might actually end this, and doing it in the same tone he used to discuss cattle feed. "Why?" she said. He looked faintly uncomfortable, which on his face read as a slight tension around the jaw. "What do you mean, why?" "You don't owe me anything, Gideon." "You went into a blizzard," he said, like this settled something, like it was an accounting he'd been doing, and this was the number he'd arrived at, and the math was not complicated. It's not only that," he said, cutting her off, not roughly but firmly, the way he cut off conversations that were going somewhere he'd already decided against. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him choosing words with the care of a man who didn't have a large supply of them and needed to make them count. "Sarah, my wife. She was sick for 2 years before she died," he said. "I watched her get smaller and quieter, and I kept thinking it would turn around, and it didn't. And after she was gone, this place got—" He stopped, tried again. "Elsie was 5. The ranch needed running. I ran it. That was what there was to do, so I did it." He looked at the table. "I didn't expect that to be the rest of it. I didn't put a name on it. But I think somewhere in the last 5 years I made my peace with the idea that there wasn't going to be more than that." He looked up at her. "And then you got off a train with a trunk that weighed as much as a dead man's sins, and you burned the porridge every day for a week, and you fixed my daughter's doll with gold thread, and you went into a storm after me, and I'm not—" He stopped. He looked briefly like a man who'd said more than he'd planned to say, and wasn't sure what to do about that. "I'm not going to pretend that doesn't mean something," he said. "Just because I can't name it correctly yet." Vivian sat across from him and said nothing for a long moment. The fire popped. Somewhere upstairs, Elsie shifted in her sleep. "I didn't plan for it to mean something either," she said finally. "Any of it. I know. I came here to disappear. I know that too." She looked at him. He looked at her. It was not a comfortable look. It was the look of two people who've said enough true things in one conversation that the air between them has changed its nature, and both of them are aware of this, and neither of them is quite sure what to do next with that awareness. Gideon moved first, pushing back from the table. He stood on his bad leg with the careful deliberateness of a man reminding himself to be practical, and he picked up the lamp from the table. "Get some sleep," he said. "Thomas is coming early tomorrow, and someone's going to need to tell him about the East Pasture." "I know about the East Pasture," she said. "I know you do." He looked at her for one more moment, and there was something in it. Not the careful, measuring look, not the neutrality, but not the fully unguarded thing from the ravine either. Something in between. Something that was finding its own name at its own pace. "Good night, Vivian." "Good night," she said. He went upstairs. She sat at the table in the dark kitchen for a while, listening to the house settle, thinking about federal judges and April and the weight of portable fortunes and the specific, unexpected feeling of being known by someone who hadn't tried to know you, who had simply paid attention until knowing was what happened naturally. She got up and went to the front room, and she stood for a moment in front of the iron trunk. She put her wrapped hand flat on the lid. Not a vault anymore, she thought. Not armor. She wasn't sure exactly what it was instead, but something had shifted in the accounting of it, and she could feel it even if she couldn't name it yet. She went to bed. The trunk sat in the front room in the dark, holding its contents with considerably less urgency than it had 3 months ago, on a platform in Chicago where a woman had stood with a one-way ticket to Wyoming and a decision that had felt like the end of something. It had not been the end of something. That was becoming clear. April came the way April always came to Wyoming. Not gently, not with the soft focused warmth that people in more forgiving climates associated with the word spring, but in fits and arguments, 3 warm days followed by a hard frost, followed by mud so deep it swallowed boots whole. The ranch emerged from winter the way everything emerged from winter out here. Damaged in small ways, inventory taken, repairs begun. Gideon's leg healed. Not cleanly. There was a pull to the muscle on cold mornings that he suspected would be with him for years, a reminder written into the tissue that the territory had opinions about men who went out in blizzards without enough rope. He didn't complain about it. Complaining about it would have meant discussing it, and discussing it would have required revisiting the events of that night in a way that he wasn't ready to do with any regularity. Some things got filed under, survived it, and left there. Vivian's hands healed faster than Dr. Pratt expected, which the doctor attributed to her general stubbornness, and which Vivian attributed to the fact that she'd refused to baby them past the point of strict necessity. By late March, she was back to full capacity, which on the Ashcroft Ranch meant something considerably more demanding than it had meant when she'd arrived in February. She could split kindling now without thinking about it. She could read the horses' moods before they expressed them. She knew which of the cattle were trouble, and which were merely dramatic, which were the same animal in different costumes but required different handling. She'd become, without quite marking the moment it happened, someone who belonged to this place. That was the thing about the frontier that no one who hadn't lived it could adequately explain to someone who hadn't. It didn't ask you who you'd been. It only asked what you could do today. And if today you could do more than yesterday, then yesterday's failures were already buried under the next task. There was something almost ruthless about it. Something that Vivian, who had spent most of her adult life in a world that never forgot and rarely forgave, found unexpectedly merciful. Judge Alderman arrived in Ridge Creek on the 14th of April, 3 days into his spring circuit, accompanied by a clerk and a weathered saddlebag full of territorial business. He was a compact, deliberate man in his late 50s with the complexion of someone who'd spent 3 decades riding between towns in all weather, and he had the particular quality of attention that good judges develop. The ability to listen without signaling where he was going, to hear the shape of a thing before responding to its surface. Gideon had written him in March. A short letter, characteristically without excess language, saying that he had a situation involving property rights and inheritance law that deserved a fair hearing before a circuit court with no local entanglements, and that he'd be grateful for an hour of the judge's time during the April session. He'd handed Vivian the draft before he sealed it. She'd read it standing at the kitchen counter. "You didn't mention me by name," she said. "I didn't figure that was my name to put in a letter," he said. She'd looked at him for a moment, then handed it back. "It's good," she said, which was how she said things that mattered when she didn't want to make too much of them, and he'd sealed the letter and sent it. Alderman came to the ranch on the evening of the 15th, for supper rather than a formal meeting, which had been his preference. He sat at the kitchen table where 2 months ago Vivian had sat with her wrapped hands and told Gideon the truth about Harlan Blackwood, and he ate Vivian's roast, which he had by now mastered to the point where it was genuinely good rather than merely edible. And he talked to Elsie about snakes, a subject Elsie had opinions on, and he asked Gideon about the spring cattle outlook with the interest of a man who'd grown up farming before the law got hold of him. After supper, Elsie went to bed. The 3 of them sat at the table with coffee, and Vivian opened the trunk. She'd thought about which documents to present first. She'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks, organizing the case in her head the way her father had taught her to organize any argument. Start with what's irrefutable, build to what's contested, never let them see you uncertain. She set the papers on the table in the order she'd decided on, and she presented her case without theatrics, without the trembling urgency of someone asking for mercy. She presented it the way her father would have, as a matter of fact requiring correct resolution. Alderman listened. He read. He asked questions that were specific and occasionally sharp, and she answered each one directly. When she got to the physician's declarations, he read both documents twice, and his expression shifted in a way that was small but legible. "You have the original will?" he said. "Notarized, dated, witnessed by 3 parties whose names and current addresses I can provide. The financial conversion documentation, complete. Every transaction, every intermediary, dated and receipted. And the company has been operating continuously under your uncle's direction since your father's death." "Yes, 14 months. Alderman set the papers down and looked at his coffee cup for a moment, and then at Vivian with the measuring qualities she'd learned to recognize as thinking rather than doubt. "Mrs. he started. "Miss Blackwood," she said. "Technically, still." Alderman glanced at Gideon. Gideon's expression gave him nothing, which was its own kind of information. The judge looked back at Vivian. "Miss Blackwood, What you have here is, in my professional assessment, a substantially stronger case than what was presented to the Chicago court. The mental incompetency declarations are the weakest documents I've seen used to justify asset seizure in 30 years of law. The conflict of interest with the presiding judge is, he stopped, chose his word carefully, significant. Can you do anything about a Chicago judge? Gideon said. Not directly, but the Federal Circuit Court for Wyoming Territory can rule on the validity of the property claim independent of the Illinois proceedings. Your company assets, the financial instruments you've described, the ownership documentation, all of this falls within federal jurisdiction when the plaintiff has established residency in another territory. He paused. Have you established residency here? Vivian looked at Gideon. He was looking at her with the same careful steadiness he'd been looking at her with for 3 months. Not pushing, not signaling, just present. Yes, she said. I have. Alderman nodded once. Then I'll need those documents filed with my clerk before I leave Ridge Creek. I'll open the case at the June session. Your uncle's legal team will be formally notified and given opportunity to respond. They'll likely request a delay, which I'll allow once and not twice. He looked at her evenly. I won't tell you it's certain. Law is never certain. But I will tell you that if this case comes before me with these documents intact, the weight of evidence is not on your uncle's side. The kitchen was quiet, in the way it got quiet when something real had just happened. Thank you, Vivian said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, steadier than she felt, and she was grateful for it. Don't thank me yet, Alderman said, picking up his coffee cup. Thank me in June. He left an hour later, taking his clerk and his weathered saddlebag and the copies of Vivian's documents back to whatever lodging Ridge Creek provided for circuit judges, which she suspected was not the most comfortable arrangement the territory had to offer. Gideon walked him to the door and came back and sat back down at the table. Neither of them said anything for a moment. June, Vivian said finally. June, he agreed. A lot can happen between April and June. It can, he said. She started to gather the papers back toward the trunk, ordering them carefully, returning each to its place. She was aware of him watching her, not the evaluating watch, not the careful managing his own reactions watch, but something more direct than either of those. What happens, he said, if Alderman rules in your favor? She stopped. What do you mean? I mean, what happens to you, here? A pause. Do you go back? It was the question she'd been carrying for weeks, like a stone in a coat pocket, aware of its weight without taking it out to look at. She'd turned it over in her head on cold mornings and late nights, and the particular quiet of the barn when she was doing the feeding alone, and the horses were just breathing around her, and the world outside was either dark or just becoming light. The company would need managing, she said slowly. There are people there, good people, who knew my father, who've been working under my uncle's direction, and who deserve better than that. She paused. I would need to go back, eventually, for a time, to restore the right management and ensure it was properly run. For a time, Gideon said. Yes. He looked at the table. And then, he said, the word then opened something. A door she'd been standing in front of for 2 months, hand on the frame, not quite going through. She looked at this man across the table, this difficult and decent and genuinely imperfect man who'd walked into his own barn 14 years ago with nothing but the intention to build something, and had built it badly in some ways and well in others, and had loved his wife and lost her and raised his daughter and kept the lights on and written a letter to a matrimonial agency because he needed help and couldn't admit, even to himself, that he needed more than help. I don't want to live in Chicago, she said. I want to be clear about that. Something shifted in his face. I didn't know what I wanted when I left, she continued. I thought I wanted to disappear. I thought wanting anything beyond that was a luxury I'd lost the right to. She folded her hands on the table, not the nervous folding of a woman managing herself, but something quieter, something that had settled. I know more than I did. What do you know? He said, quietly. She looked at him. I know I didn't come here to find anything, and I know that's not how it worked out. He didn't say anything. He was watching her with that open quality that his face only showed in unguarded moments, the quality she'd first seen in the ravine and again across the kitchen table the night she'd told him the truth. And now here, in the lamplight, with all the papers put away and the case filed and the future approximately real in a way it hadn't been before. "Elsie calls me mother," she said. "She started 2 weeks ago. She didn't ask. She just did it." She paused. "I didn't correct her." "I know," Gideon said. "She told me she decided." He paused. "She said she discussed it with Margaret, and they were in agreement." Vivienne pressed her lips together to keep the expression that wanted to come from being too large. She wasn't entirely successful. "Gideon," she said. "Yeah. I'd like to stay." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You'd have to actually marry me. I'm aware of how it works. I'm not a romantic man. I know that. The winters here, I've survived one," she said. "I have opinions about the winters. The work is—" "Gideon." She looked at him steadily. "I split the wood this morning. I know what the work is." He was quiet for another moment. She could see him doing the thing he did where he tried to find the practical objections and ran out of them. It was, she'd come to understand, how he arrived at what he actually wanted, by eliminating everything that stood between him and it. He pushed back from the table. He stood up, bad leg and all, and he came around the table to where she was sitting, and she looked up at him and he said, "I'm not going to do this correctly. I'm going to say it wrong." "You've been saying most things correctly," she said. "In your own way." He put his hand on the table next to hers, not taking her hand, just placing his next to it, close enough to be deliberate. "I've got a listing porch and about 200 head and a daughter who takes positions on letters of the alphabet," he said. "I've got a bad leg that's going to complain about cold weather for the rest of my life, and I'm not easy to live with, and I don't have anything to offer you that comes close to what's in that trunk." "I know," she said. "I'm asking you to stay anyway." She turned her hand over and put it in his. "I'm already here," she said. It wasn't a sweeping declaration. It wasn't the kind of moment that announces itself. It was two people sitting in a kitchen at the end of a long winter making a decision that was partly reasonable and partly not reasonable at all, which is how most of the important decisions in a life actually work, even when you'd prefer them to be cleaner. He sat back down, not releasing her hand. They stayed that way for a while, in the quiet of the house, with the fire doing its work and the Wyoming spring pressing against the windows, uncertain and real. They were married on the last Sunday of April. The ceremony was held at the Ridge Creek Meeting Hall, which was also used for town meetings and the annual harvest auction, and one memorable occasion in 1887 for sheltering 12 families during a flood, and which had therefore hosted enough of human life to handle a wedding without making a fuss about it. The minister was a soft-spoken man named Howell, who'd been in the territory 15 years and had learned that frontier weddings didn't require sermons so much as they required efficiency and occasional warmth, and he provided both. Vivienne wore one of her dark dresses, not the one she'd arrived in, which had been past saving after the blizzard, but the better of the two she'd brought, freshened with the length of cream-colored ribbon at the collar that Elsie had selected with the authority of someone who'd appointed herself the aesthetic committee of this entire enterprise. Her hair was up. She had calluses on her palms and a faint scar across 2 fingers from the rope burns and a smudge of lamp oil on her left wrist that she'd noticed too late to do anything about. She thought she looked probably exactly like what she'd become. She found she was all right with that. Gideon stood at the front of the hall in his good coat, the one he'd worn to Sarah's funeral and hadn't put on since, which Vivienne had pressed the night before without comment and hung on the door where he'd find it. He looked uncomfortable in the way men who live most of their lives outdoors look uncomfortable in formal arrangements, slightly constrained, aware of his own hands, and he looked at Vivienne when she came in with the expression of a man who has stopped trying to manage what he's feeling and is just letting it be there on his face. Elsie stood beside him in the blue dress that still fit. If you didn't argue with it too much, holding Margaret with one arm and functioning as an extremely small witness with the serious dignity of someone who understood the importance of her role and intended to discharge it correctly. The hall was full. Every family that had come with food after the blizzard was there. Cal Pritchard was there, hat in hand, standing near the back with the look of a man who was genuinely glad to be wrong. Even Mrs. Harker had come, seated in the 3rd row with an expression of carefully maintained neutrality that was, from a woman of her particular convictions, something close to warmth. Howell spoke briefly and well. Gideon said his part in the direct, unadorned way he said everything, without flourish, without looking away. Vivian said hers. And then it was done, and Elsie said, loudly enough for the back row to hear, "I told Margaret this was going to happen in February," which produced a laugh from the hall that broke the formal air completely and made Vivian's eyes do something she hadn't given them permission to do. Gideon squeezed her hand once. She squeezed back. The community that had watched her with suspicion for 3 months surrounded her with the particular warmth of people who've made up their minds in the right direction and want you to know it. Women whose names she'd learned over difficult weeks pressed her hands and welcomed her. Old Tom Birch, from the young couple who'd brought the bread after the blizzard, shook Gideon's hand and told him he'd done well, and Gideon said, "I know it," with the plain confidence of a man who'd stopped being uncertain about the thing. Judge Alderman's ruling came in the 3rd week of June. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the same day of the week, Vivian noticed, that she had arrived in Ridge Creek on the westbound train. She sat at the kitchen table and read it with both hands flat on the paper, and her heart doing what it had done on the platform that first day, hammering against something that was trying to be calm. The Federal Circuit Court of Wyoming Territory had reviewed the property claim filed on behalf of Vivian Blackwood Ashcroft and found the documents establishing her ownership of Blackwood Industrial to be valid, predating and superseding the contested proceedings in Illinois. The mental incompetency declarations had been reviewed and rejected as procedurally insufficient. The case had been forwarded to the appropriate federal authority for review of the Illinois proceedings, with particular attention to the conduct of the presiding judge. Harlan Blackwood's legal team had 45 days to respond. They responded in 30. Harlan himself sent a letter, through his solicitors, that was professionally worded and completely without any acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and that offered, in the language of men who've run out of legal leverage, a settlement. He would relinquish management of Blackwood Industrial, produce a full financial accounting of the past 14 months, and withdraw all outstanding legal claims. In exchange, Vivian would not pursue the further federal review of the Illinois proceedings. She sat with that letter for 2 days. She talked to Gideon, not asking him to decide. She'd never needed anyone to decide things for her, but thinking out loud in the way she'd learned to think out loud with him, using his particular quality of listening to find her own conclusions. "If I push it further," she said, "Harlan faces real consequences. The judge possibly faces consequences. The physicians." She paused. "It would take years. I'd be in legal proceedings in multiple jurisdictions for years." "What do you want?" Gideon said. "I want it to be over," she said, which was the most honest thing she could say. "I want the company in the right hands and my father's work protected and Harlan out of it, and I want to be here." "Then take the settlement." "It lets him walk away without real consequences." "Yes," Gideon said. "It does." She looked at him. "You don't think I should fight it?" "I think you should do what gets you what you actually want," he said. "What Harlan deserves and what you need aren't the same question." She knew that. She'd known it. She'd needed someone to say it plainly without making the decision for her. She took the settlement. She spent 2 weeks in July in Cheyenne with a federal solicitor, signing documents and issuing instructions and establishing the management structure for Blackwood Industrial that she'd designed over months of quiet mornings on the ranch. A board of directors composed of people her father had trusted, with a managing director named Harriet Cole, who'd run the company's accounting for 11 years, and who took the appointment with the steady competence of someone who'd been doing the job informally for years already. She did not go to Chicago. She conducted everything through intermediaries and the federal court's jurisdiction, and when it was done, Blackwood Industrial was hers in every legal sense and managed by people she trusted. And Harlan Blackwood had been reduced to a former employee with a generous severance and a permanent prohibition from the company's operations. She came back to the ranch on a Thursday evening in late July with the last of the documents signed and a feeling in her chest she had to think about for a while before she identified it correctly. It was the feeling of being finished with something. Gideon was at the fence line when she came up the road in the wagon. He saw her from a distance and he raised one hand, not waving, just marking her arrival, the way you'd mark the return of something you'd been keeping track of, and went back to his work. By the time she'd gotten the horses settled and come around to where he was kneeling by a post that had been giving trouble since February. "How'd it go?" he said, without looking up. "It's done," she said. He looked up then. She looked at him. This man in his worn coat with his bad leg kneel and his weathered face and his entirely insufficient quantity of words. And she thought about what it meant that Dunn felt like something she was bringing home rather than something she was leaving behind. "Good," he said. He went back to the post. "Thomas left the east gate open again. 2 calves got out." "Are they recovered?" "Yes." "I'll talk to Thomas." "He knows," Gideon said. "I already talked to him." Was that a conversation or a demonstration? He looked up again, something around his eyes that was as close as he got to being amused. Bit of both. She sat down on the fence rail next to where he was working, which was not a graceful thing to do, and she managed it anyway. And she looked out across the property. The east pasture coming green now, the barn solid in the afternoon light, the listing porch visible from here if you knew where to look, the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, where Elsie was theoretically starting supper under the supervision of the kitchen cat. It looked, she thought, like something worth crossing a continent for. Not because it was beautiful in any obvious way. It wasn't, particularly, not the manicured beauty of the life she'd come from. It was the beauty of things that had survived what they'd been through and were still standing and still functional and still, in their imperfect way, growing. She'd been the same kind of beautiful for a while now and hadn't quite let herself see it. Elsie appeared at this kitchen door and shouted something at them that the distance turned into a syllable shape without clear meaning, but the general import was dinner, and she disappeared back inside. Gideon stood up from his kneel, slowly, bad leg first. "She burned the potatoes," he said. "How do you know?" "She only shouts like that when something's gone wrong and she wants company before we notice." Vivian looked at the kitchen door. She looked at this man next to her. She thought about burned potatoes and shouting daughters and listing porches and all the ordinary, unromantic, completely irreplaceable components of a life that was genuinely hers. "Come on then," she said. They walked back toward the house together across the July grass, the evening light going gold behind them, the imperfect and beloved structure of the Ashcroft Ranch holding itself up against the Wyoming sky the way it always had, stubbornly, practically, and with no particular interest in being anything other than exactly what it was. Inside, the iron trunk sat against the front room wall. It wasn't locked anymore. Elsie used it sometimes as a step stool to reach the high shelf, which was a function it performed adequately. Vivian had moved some of the documents to proper storage in Cheyenne, and the space left inside held extra quilts for winter, and Elsie's collection of interesting rocks, and a length of golden thread still wound on a card, kept for no reason more specific than that some things deserve to be kept. Not everything that matters needs to be explained. Not every treasure needs a lock. Some things just need to be put somewhere safe and left there and trusted to hold. The screen door banged behind them. Gideon looked at the burned potatoes and then at his daughter and said, with the weary accuracy of a man who'd been here before, "How?" Elsie, holding Margaret at her side with one hand, said with perfect dignity, "The cat was distracting." Vivian went to the stove and looked at the situation and said, "They're not burned through. We can save the bottom half." She picked up the wooden spoon. "Get me the salt." Elsie got the salt. Gideon sat at the table watching the two of them work around each other in the kitchen. The woman who'd arrived in February not knowing how to cook, and the daughter who was learning with mixed results, and the cat sitting on the windowsill rendering opinions. And he felt something that he didn't put a name on because he didn't need to. Some things you don't need to name. You just need to not miss them while they're happening. He didn't miss it. Outside, the Wyoming sky did what the Wyoming sky did, when enormous and indifferent and spectacular in the fading light. All that space pressing down on all that land, the frontier stretching in every direction without apology. It was a hard country. It had always been a hard country. But the lamp was lit, and the fire was warm, and in the morning there would be work, and they would do it together, and that was enough. That had always been enough, for anyone who understood what enough actually meant. It meant this, exactly this.